To Friday's seminar, our second talk of the term. My name is Miguel Tigliozzi, Professor of Civil Engineering. So today we are very glad to have Professor Geoff Rose, Director of the Institute Transportation Studies at Monash University, and a great friend of PSU. He spent a sabbatical here a couple of years ago, and he's always doing very interesting research, and I'm sure it's going to be. Sure. Professor Geoff Rose from Monash University. He has a long bio, but I'm just going to say he's the director of the Institute of Transport Studies at Monash University in Melbourne. A great friend of PSU and our faculty.
Thanks, Miguel. It does only seem maybe like it was a couple of years since I was here, but it was in fact 5 years ago that I spent a period at PSU. And it's great to be back. The material that I'm presenting today is based on the PhD research that was conducted by one of our PhD students, Chris de Goede, and I want to acknowledge his contribution to the work. And the other collaborator on this is Graham Curry, who's our Professor of Public Transport. To give you a feel of what I'm going to cover today, pardon me, I'll start by defining what I mean by this term travel plan, and then I'll identify what were the research gaps and the aims that guided this work. I'll then talk about the research methods, outline some key results from the study, and then outline the main conclusions from this research. So what is a travel plan? In Australia, it's a document that contains measures to manage car use and to encourage use of more sustainable forms of transport. In some parts of the world, they're called TDM plans. In parts of Europe, they're called mobility management plans. They're typically developed for an individual site, like a school or a workplace. And in fact, a lot of the travel plans that have been developed in Australia have been developed for particularly workplaces and to a lesser extent schools. But what we were seeing in Australia was increasingly new residential apartment buildings were starting to require travel plans. And as I said before, it's a document, so these travel plans are documented in a report. I'll talk a little bit later today about what's the background of the organisations that often develop the travel plans. And what we're starting to see in Victoria is more of these being required for new residential developments. And so we decided to focus this work on apartment buildings, essentially, and look at the role of travel plans for apartment buildings. And that was potentially an opportunity, but as I'll flag in a moment, it also presents some challenges, at least from the perspective of trying to evaluate the effectiveness of travel plans. So what are they trying to do? Essentially, if we look at typically where a travel plan's developed, say for a workplace or a school, you could imagine conditions before and after the travel plan. What we're really trying to do is move some of the trips from car driver trips across to more sustainable transport modes, be that walk, cycle, public transport, or perhaps reducing the need to travel. When we began this work, we did a review of the literature, and I won't spend a lot of time talking about the literature per se, but I'll comment about the research gaps that we identified and how that helped to frame the aims for this study. One of the things we identified in the literature was that although there'd been quite a lot of work done around travel plans, there hadn't been very much systematic assessment of the quality of the travel plan, that is, the quality of that document and what was in the strategy itself. And we can't guarantee that if we improve the quality of the document, it'll necessarily improve the results, because it depends on how it's implemented. But if we start off with a very poor travel plan, it probably reduces our chances of having the effects that we want to in terms of mode shift. And so our first research aim was to assess the quality of the travel plans that were being undertaken in Victoria for new residential and apartment developments. The second thing that we identified was that there was very little evidence of the effectiveness of travel plans that had been developed for new residential developments. There's certainly results in the literature on the effectiveness of travel plans for workplaces and schools, but really nothing around apartment buildings. And one of the challenges from the point of view of evaluating effectiveness is that we don't have a simple case like I showed you before of a site where we can take measurements before and after the travel plan, because there is no before data. This is a site that's been developed as a block of apartments. So it's not like it's the block of apartments with or without the travel plan. When it's built, the travel plan comes into effect. So that presents some challenges. Typically what people would do was use census data or secondary data sources to say, well, what would we expect to be the baseline for mode shares at a development in that area, and how does the mode share at this site with the travel plan compare to that? But the problem is that secondary data has its weaknesses. Particularly census data in Australia is only collected every 5 years, so it may not be current. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the same location, and it's not always based on the same type of dwelling. So average trip generation rates, for example, may be based on a range of land uses, not just particular intensity apartment developments. But we felt this was an important enough issue that we wanted to undertake some work in this area. So the secondary aim of this study was to try and measure the effectiveness of the travel plans at new residential developments. And the remainder of my presentation is going to focus first on assessing the quality of travel plans from a sample of travel plans in Victoria, and then we'll move to look at how we tried to measure the effectiveness of the travel plans at a number of sites. So, travel ban, just a second, sorry. When implementing a travel plan, there's a need to consider what's the commitment from the developer as well as the future property manager, and to clarify the roles and responsibilities of the travel plan coordinator at the site. Because these are not like workplaces, they're going to be residential developments, there may be a building supervisor on the site, but one of the challenges is who's got responsibility for actually implementing the travel plan. There is also a need to think about whether there's a budget for implementing the travel plan and whether there's any plan for ongoing communication with the users at the site. And one of the challenges is we often think that success is a linear process. In reality, there's a lot of things that happen along the way. And what we were trying to do was look at what is the success of some of these travel plans that have been undertaken at different residential developments. So, assessing, just a second, something's gone wrong here. My apologies. Something's happened with the slides. Can I just take a moment? Not sure what happened when I copy these across. We're going to go to this version. So the first part of the research was assessing travel plan quality. And we did this by developing a framework that was based in the literature on what are the features of travel plans that might be associated with higher quality. We had 6 key areas and 55 criteria that were scored or assessed for each of the travel plans. The focus of this study was in Victoria, so we sourced 31 travel plans. We believe this was most of the travel plans that have been developed in Victoria, and most of these were in the capital city of Melbourne for the last 3 years. And we reviewed each of the travel plans for its content and assessed it against the scoring framework. To outline the assessment framework, there were a number of components. The first part, which took up about 15% of the assessment, was background information about the site and the development, information about the existing conditions in the local area, what were the traffic conditions in the local area, public transport access, access to cycle paths and the like, whether the travel plan included explicit objectives and targets, whether it documented the measures that were going to be employed in the travel plan. How is the travel plan going to be managed in terms of how is it going to be implemented, by whom, and over what time frame? And finally, was there any component of review and monitoring? Now, in the context of this presentation, I won't focus on all of those components. I want to just give you a feel for how we approach this assessment. And I'm going to do that in terms of these last two, the objectives and targets and the travel plan measures. So for each of those categories, there were a number of characteristics that the assessor needed to look for, and we assigned a certain number of points depending on how well the travel plan meet each of those criteria. So for objectives and targets, are a set of clear and appropriate objectives identified, and are there appropriate targets? And you'll see that there was a range of scores for each of these criteria. Likewise, for the measures that were included in the package, a range of scores. Now, the first thing that any scoring system raises is, will there be a difference in the assessment depending on who does the rating? And the way we tried to account for that was, in addition to Chris doing the ratings, we also sent a sample of the travel plans to two other practicing professionals in the TDM area in Australia, and they independently rated the sample of travel plans, and there was very little difference in the rating scores. So we believe that it was a reasonably reliable measure. Now, I hasten to add, this was based on what we believe was best practice from the literature. There would be scope to come back and maybe refine the criteria that are in this assessment process. But there are similar schemes to this used overseas. So Transport for London has I think it's a web-based assessment tool that people can essentially answer a set of criteria to see what's the quality of the travel plan that they're submitting for a particular area. And the idea of that is to try and improve the quality of the documentation and the travel plans that are implemented. I mentioned before that the travel plans tend to get developed by different types of organisations. Most of these travel plans had been developed by traffic engineering firms. Some were by town planning firms, and then there was a smattering of other sorts of organisations. In terms of the types of developments that were covered, most were residential or predominantly residential developments. There was some real mixed use, so less apartments and more commercial or retail development, and some education, but the vast majority included apartment-style developments. In terms of the measures that the travel plans commonly included as part of the strategy, bike parking was a main one. 90% of the travel plans specified that they're going to provide bike parking on site. New residence kits. So the idea here is when people are moving into the apartment, there's a kit of information that will outline what the travel alternatives are, what the local public transport services are, where walk and bike facilities are close to the apartment. Free or discounted public transport tickets, local maps, and then the percentages dropped off. Car sharing at 35% was the base at the time when this work was done. I think for some of the apartment buildings that are going up in Melbourne, we're probably seeing an increase in the number that might be looking at including car sharing as part of the development. Now, how did the travel plans perform? So across those different areas where they were assessed, what I'm going to show on this table is what was the worst performing travel plan, what was the best performing travel plan, and what was the average. And to give us sort of a visual way of assessing the quality, we're using this thing called a Harvey ball. So the more of the ball that's coloured in, the better the score on that criteria. So the lowest scoring travel plans didn't do very well. They scored 22% overall. And to give you a bit of an idea of how low the bar was set in some cases, there was one travel plan that had been clearly produced by a consultant using seek or find and replace with a word processor, because the name on the cover was different from the name of the development as you read through the document. And that is perhaps not surprisingly, if that's the level of effort that's going into it, it may not be a very high quality document. The highest rating one scored a maximum of 69%. And what you see here is that the highest scoring one scored very well in terms of outlining the existing conditions at the site, specifying objectives and targets, identifying travel plan measures, but it was the travel plan management where it fell down. And this was something that we noticed in a number of the plans. There was no articulation of how was this going to be implemented. Who had responsibility for the travel plan? who was going to be following up with the residents? It was a document that was prepared at the time the building was developed and then would just be sitting on a shelf somewhere and wouldn't necessarily be implemented in full. Overall, against this performance metric, the average score was a fail at 47%. Now, again, this is a metric that we've used to try and assess travel plan quality. I think there's scope to refine this and probably to go back to a group of practitioners and refine the sort of measures and the weights that we gave to the different measures. But at least this was a consistent assessment framework that was used across all of those travel plans. So I suppose that the takeaway message for us from this was that there certainly appears to be scope to improve the quality of the travel plans that are being developed for developments in Melbourne. And it may be that by having some sort of an assessment framework, the consultants that are developing these travel plans at least would have a benchmark to try and improve their documentation over time. And as I highlighted, the travel plan management was the one which was particularly deficient in terms of any follow-up for how the travel plan was going to be implemented. Now, I've got myself out of order with this. We're going to go back. Okay. Now back to the second component, and this was how can we assess how effective the travel plans are? And the approach that we took here was case control methodology. So we identified a set of sites where travel plans had been implemented, took some measurements at those sites, and then compared them to apartment buildings that we known had been developed around the same time, but for which there was no travel plan. So the case sites were all apartment buildings with travel plans. They were 4 new residential developments built and occupied, and the travel plans had been implemented at those sites. The control sites were located nearby. They were also apartment towers that had no travel plan associated with them. But it'd be fair to say that going with this methodology wasn't without its challenges. It was fairly easy to identify a set of case sites where they had travel plans, but it took a lot of work to identify appropriate, close control sites, and also to get agreement from the building managers at those sites to do some sort of a travel survey. To a certain extent, we were limited by what was available, so we couldn't say, oh, it'd be lovely if there was a control site here and it's a block of land that hasn't been developed. So we had to look at what other developments had occurred near the control sites, near the case site, in a similar time frame. What we aimed to do was ensure that there was a good match in terms of location. So all of the case and control sites were within about 200 metres of each other. They were similar in terms of average dwelling size, meaning how many bedrooms per apartment. Similar in terms of on-site parking provision, the proportion of owner-occupiers, and also that the year in occupation, the year that the building was occupied. The 4 case sites were ranged from about 5 to multi-storey developments, and the control sites, as I said, were all within 200 metres of those case sites. Geographically, in terms of where they were located in Melbourne, this form of development tends to be occurring outside the inner CBD. So the Melbourne CBD is here. So this is the South Melbourne, South Yarra area where 4 of the sites were, and then the inner northern suburbs were the other sites. So the data collection and analysis at the case and control sites, we did a count of people by transport mode who were entering and leaving the sites. So that was for the 4 case sites and the 4 control sites. We also did counts of car and bike parking on the site. So with the help of the building managers, got access to the underground facilities and were able to look at utilisation of car spaces, utilisation of bike parking. We also did some comparisons to published vehicle trip generation rates, and comparisons then were made between the case and the control sites. So first off, one measure that we looked at was the number of vehicle trips per dwelling in the weekday AM peak. The ITE, through its trip generation manual, does publish rates for apartment buildings. And this is a US rate, so it's not automatically transferable to Australia, but at least it was one baseline. We don't have any comparable data that's published in Victoria, but the Roads and Traffic Authority in New South Wales has a trip generation manual, and they had data from 2002, and then they updated their apartment rates in 2013. Our control sites were similar to the New South Wales data, but the case sites had lower vehicle trip rates. So relative to the sites that had the travel plans, the sites that did not have travel plans had more vehicle trips per dwelling in the peak period. We also did a travel survey of the residents in the apartment building so that we could get a look at the mode shares of travel during the weekday AM peak period. So the control sites with no travel plan had car driver trip rates of a bit under 40%. Again, when you go into the outer suburbs of Melbourne, the car driver rate would be much higher, but this is inner city. Melbourne's got a very extensive public transport network, so that's about what we'd expect in terms of the mode shares. At the travel plan sites, we saw a slightly different distribution. So again, consistent with what we were hoping, I suppose, in terms of the effectiveness of the travel plans, about a 14 percentage point reduction in car driver, an increase in public transport and walk. And the reason why we put public and transport and walk together was because when we did the observations at the site, we couldn't be sure whether a person was walking to their destination or walking to public transport. We knew that they didn't drive from the site. And also slightly higher levels of cycling. One of the things that we did take an interest in was the utilisation of the car spaces at the apartment buildings. And there were lower car and more bikes per dwelling at the sites with travel plans than the sites without travel plans. So that suggested that maybe car ownership was lower at those sites with the travel plans and number of bikes higher. When we looked at the utilisation of car spaces, one thing that we noticed was that the bike parking was very heavily utilised. And one of the things that's come out of this research in terms of what we think is a growing problem in Melbourne, at least for apartment buildings, is even if they put in the minimum bike parking that they have to put in, it's probably not meeting the needs of the residents. And even though the planning regulations might specify what's the amount of car parking and what's the amount of bike parking, they don't actually say where the bike parking has to be placed. So in some of the control sites, the bike parking was on the site, but you went down to the car park and down a dark alley and around behind the boiler room, and there was a shed round there where they stuck the bikes. So it didn't necessarily mean that the bike parking was as accessible as the car parking. At these sites we found that there was an oversupply of parking for cars and an undersupply of parking for bikes. And in recent times in Melbourne there's been a very high profile case of an apartment building where the owners wanted to build it with zero car parking and the State Planning Authority would not allow that. They said that there was most likely going to be some cars owned by the residents there and they didn't want that to be spillover on the street. So I think we've still got a lot more work to do to look at this balance between car parking and bike parking in apartment buildings, and also how do we manage the bike parking to make sure that it's accessible rather than inaccessible bike parking. So in conclusion, at the beginning of the presentation I highlighted that we had two aims. One of those aims was to look to assess the quality of the travel plans that had been implemented for developments in Melbourne, and secondly to evaluate their effectiveness. In relation to the first one, we found that there was a real diversity in the quality of the travel plans which were assessed. And the thing which was very, very consistent was very little attention to detail about how the travel plan would actually be implemented, who would be funding it, who'd be looking after it, what happens when there's residential turnover in the building. So if there are people that are renting apartments, what happens when their lease is up and they move out, who's going to supply the information to the new residents. Those sorts of details had not been thought through. We felt that the assessment framework that we've developed could be used by local government in Victoria to do a first-pass assessment of the quality of travel plans which are submitted, and that might provide a basis for the local government authority providing feedback to the applicant for the development about the quality of the travel plan for that site, with the aim of trying to improve the quality of those travel plans over time. And we think that if we improve the quality of those travel plans, that might increase the chance that we'll see the changes in travel behaviour that these travel plans are intended to produce. In terms of evaluating the effectiveness of travel plans, we did observe lower car use at the developments with travel plans compared to similar developments that didn't have travel plans. So that's encouraging. And the control sites that we used, we believe, provided a more accurate indication of travel plan effectiveness over the secondary sources of data that we could get access to, which were those published trip rates, because they seem to provide a high estimate of amount of vehicle use compared to the sites that we were looking at. And I think that one area that we've identified out of this where there's scope for further work, there is an effect that's looked at in the literature which is called self-selection bias. So it may be that one of the reasons why the car use is lower at the sites with the travel plan is because people chose to live in those sites because there was a travel plan and because they wanted to use their cars less. In Chris's research, he started to explore that residential self-selection effect. We think it may account for part of the difference that we measured, but certainly not all of it. So there is still some effect left from the travel plan. But part of the challenge with assessing the residential self-selection is that we only had a total of 8 sites. So we didn't have the statistical power. So it would be nice if we could collect some data at some more sites, because that might give us a better chance to look at the statistical significance of that residential self-selection effect. And now I'm going to go to that one. That's my presentation. Happy to handle questions.
Sure. Michael Flynn, Civil Engineering. I was wondering if there was any incentive for the developers to include travel plans.
Yeah, there are, because as part of the planning provisions, there is potential for the developer to reduce the amount of car parking that they provide on the site if they have a travel plan. And a number of developers have done that. And our reservation about that approach is it's a case of the developer saying, oh, look, here's my travel plan. Now give me the right to build less parking. At the moment, we don't assess the quality of that travel plan, and we don't really have a mechanism to ensure that whatever's in that document's actually going to be implemented at the site. For the developer, it's certainly a case that that's going to save them money to be able to put less parking on the site, usually because it's underground parking. So in that development, which they wanted to go ahead with 0 car parking, part of their argument there was to improve housing affordability, because if people don't want to pay for a car space, it would be possible to develop the site and provide apartments at a lower cost.
You assessed travel plans based on a framework, and then you evaluated their effectiveness. Do you have enough data to evaluate your assessment?
That's a good point, yeah, closing the loop. Now, we haven't gone back to do that, and in fact, one of the things I've said to Chris, we need to go back and have a look at the quality of the travel plans for the 4 sites that we did have as treatment sites. Yeah. I think The assessment framework we felt was a good first start to at least have something that was consistent, but I think there is scope to go back and refine that more. Yeah.
Community development program. So you mentioned people were walking out of the building, and that's how you're assessing that they were walking or taking transit.
Yeah.
Are these places still? Are people parking on the street? So are they still potentially using a vehicle?
There is a small chance of that. Because the car parking was underutilised at the sites, we thought there was probably a small chance that people were parking on street. On-street parking around these areas is pretty tight, but there is a chance that there's a small margin of error associated with that.
Lee Stark in the planning department. So you looked at the utilization of the parking, but what was the numbers, the amount of residents compared to how much parking was offered? Did you look at that?
Just let me... Did I have something on? I know in some of Chris's work, we've looked at... No, I don't have the data in this presentation on the number of spaces per apartment in the apartment buildings. No, unfortunately I don't have that.
Yeah, I was curious if apartment buildings that had a reduced amount of parking available had more people use other modes because there wasn't that option.
I suspect that is in fact what we tried to do was control for that by having similar levels of parking at both the control and the case sites. Yeah.
Sam Rudisky. My question was about your consulting entities for the grading of the travel plans. So did you select local or international, and if you did choose them, why?
Oh, we were only going with travel plans that were developed for developments predominantly in Melbourne, and so we really tried to get as many travel plans as we could. Now, some of those would have been developed by international consultants, but we haven't separately identified them because a number of the major consulting firms have offices in Melbourne. All we were doing was identifying what type of consultancy it was, whether it was primarily a traffic engineering consulting or a planning type consultant.
Justin Griffith, Civil Engineering. You mentioned travel management is the key issue with these travel plans that kind of brings the overall score down. Yeah. Are there any incentives, or do you have any recommendations to how that could be better, how it could be managed better by the management groups or the developers?
It is a challenge. What happens with an apartment building is a developer gets the idea, this is at least in the Australian situation, a developer gets the idea, they get some financing to go ahead, then they sell the apartment. So one of the issues back home is what's the percentage of owner-occupiers versus renters. Once the developer's sold the development, it gets passed across to a management association for all those apartment owners. And that's when the ball starts to get dropped, because the developers had an interest to produce that document because they're going to go to the Victorian Civil and Administrative Appeals Tribunal and say, I want less parking because I've got this document. But at the moment, there isn't a mechanism then when they hand that over to the building manager for VCAT to come back and look at them. Some of the councils, local councils, are starting to get interested in this because they could potentially go back to audit. And at least if there was a commitment in the plan about how it was going to be implemented over time, the council at least would have a mechanism to go back and say, well, is this happening or is this happening? Are the residence kits still being kept up to date? At one of the apartment buildings, they were providing residents with a public transport, an annual public transport ticket. Is that still being done? Did you have a question? Yeah.
Kevin McAllister, Civil Engineering Department. So there's implementations like reducing parking and increasing bicycle space parking and stuff like that. Have they looked into doing more like incentive towards the residents? Because having like you said, the manager of the building is going to say, oh yeah, reduce parking, this will be great. But it's like putting people next to a lake doesn't mean they're going to fish. Yeah. So is there talks of incentives to the actual renters and owners
Yeah,
to increase that?
It really is a challenge because once the building's occupied, the building manager is usually more worried about where's the trash going, is their mail being put into the mailboxes correctly. At the moment, they don't perceive that their job is managing the travel to and from the site unless the door breaks into the car park or something like that. So there is, I think, also a cultural shift needed about what is the role and responsibility of that building manager. They do act a bit like gatekeepers, though, because one of the real challenges when we were wanting to do the surveys is you've got to get agreement from the building manager to be able to put anything in the mailboxes, because all the mailboxes are inside the development, so you can't get into them. And so Chris did a great job of developing close relationships with 8 building managers to at least get through the door. But even then, for some of them, this was a bit outside their normal comfort zone, because it wasn't. They see themselves very much just managing the infrastructure of the building and not so much the behaviour of the residents.
I'd like to make a comment about the issue of residential self-selection. In my point of view, I don't think self-selection would be a limitation or even an issue for the research, because if now you're actually supplying housing that gives people the option or encourage them to use alternative mode of transportation, and people are living there because they self-select or they would rather do that, then you're actually meeting a market preference or unmet demand that's currently not supported. So I wouldn't really necessarily look at it as a limitation.
I suppose that the risk is that same household might have had the same travel behaviour, even if they were in a different development, because that was the lifestyle they wanted to live, keeping in mind that both the control and the case sites are relatively close by, so they've got similar levels of public transport accessibility, walk and bike accessibility. So if they were attracted to these developments because of the package of things that were being offered to them as a resident, we may ascribe more effect in terms of the reductions in car use to the travel plan, when in fact it was because people who had a predisposition to use the car less were the ones that were going into those developments. Again, as I said, the follow-up work that Chris did identified that there is a bit of a residential self-selection effect, but it certainly doesn't explain all of the percentage reductions in car use associated with the developments.
2 questions. One, is there money set aside for the building managers to do these activities? And 2, the new resident kits, are they put together by the building managers or by a city agency?
Definitely not the second. And the problem is that's not even documented in a lot of these plans. So they might say we're going to have new resident kits, but who's got the responsibility for that? And how is it going to be funded? Again, that's that implementation part of the plan that regularly falls down. The reality in terms of who would fund it, if there was going to be ongoing measures like the costs associated with those kits or the provision of public transport tickets for residents in the building, then that would have to be funded by a levy on the building owners. And the building owners would all have to agree to that, or it would have to be a majority of the building owners would have to agree to it to get it through a board of management meeting.
I was thinking one of the things they do in other jurisdictions is they say, well, if you want fewer parking spaces, give us so much money per parking space. That money goes into a fund.
Yeah, that would be another way of managing it. Yeah.
Forgive me if I didn't see this on one of your slides. We saw the number of trips for the control and for the case sites. Did you show the number of car ownership rates between?
We had. I did have.
Of being able to offer the number of parking spaces because they have the travel plans. Okay.
So this was average cars parked per dwelling. So at the control sites it was 0.55 cars per dwelling, and it was only 0.45 at the control site. So there were fewer cars parked per dwelling, and but the case sites had slightly higher higher utilisation of the car parks that were provided. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a two-phase clarification question about car parking. First, are these all rental apartments or purchase apartments, meaning condominiums?
Mixture. So they would all, somebody owns all of them. A certain percentage of the occupants will be owners of the apartment that they're living in, and a certain percentage will be renters.
Okay, but that's a lease between an individual apartment owner, like me.
Yes,
My renter.
correct.
Okay, so it's not one big entity doesn't
No,
own the whole building.
no. All of these are what in Australia are termed strata title units. Right. So there is an owner for each separate apartment. Okay. Yeah.
So then my second question is, given that, generally, how is parking priced and attached or not attached to each unit, and then managed in all of these buildings?
So usually each apartment would have an allocated number of spaces, and it's not common for you to be able to sell that space. So you can't go along to the developer and say, oh, I'd like a 3-bedroom apartment, but I only want 1 car space. If the 3-bedroom apartments come with 2 car spaces, that's it. Now, you may be able to do a deal with people once you're through the door and rent out that car space to somebody else in the building, but that's why this case back home has created a bit of public discussion about, well, what would happen if we were building apartment buildings that had 0 car parking. Yeah.
Jan Ku from Civil Engineering. So I was wondering, what does that mean if we have more than 100% on the chart?
So there were bikes chained to a fence underneath the development, or chained to a part of a storage shed or something like that, because there was the bike racks that they provided were already full of bikes. And this is an area where I think we can improve what's happening back home, because even though the developer may meet the minimum bike parking requirements, my personal perception is that the minimum bike parking requirements are too low, particularly as we're seeing growth in cycling in Melbourne. We probably should be requiring apartment buildings to have more bike parking. But I'd argue it needs to be more than that, because if the bike parking's hidden somewhere down underneath the building, that's not going to encourage bike use. So it's very much about how much bike parking do we need, and how accessible should that bike parking be. Because if people are going to look at the choice of do I drive or take the bike, if it's much more difficult to get down and get the bike up to street level, they're likely to go with the car option. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. Geoff Brown. I'm a practicing transportation planner in a suburb of Portland. And I'm just curious how this travel plan concept, how old is it? How did it evolve? Because right now in the suburbs we focus completely on the car. We require large developments to do a traffic analysis, which
traffic
is
impact
focused
assessment?
completely on
the car.
making sure that we have provided for the car,
Yeah.
and often at a price of 0 for parking.
Yeah. I was just, when you were asking the question, I was going back and thinking, so how long have we seen travel planning practice in Australia? And my gut reaction is to say probably going back about 15 years. Australia looks a lot to the US, but we also look a lot to the UK. So travel planning practice, at least my perception of it, matured a number of years ago in the UK, particularly around workplaces. And that's where a lot of work was done in the UK. And there were a couple of people I know back home who'd been to the UK and worked, then came back to Australia. They worked in 2 separate states, and they started the wheels turning about starting to get travel plans done for workplaces. And then a number of schools did them, partly because of congestion around school pick-up and drop-off times. The move to the residential stuff is probably only within the last 3 or 4 years. Most of the travel planning practice has been around workplaces and schools. Yeah.
Do you think they were evolved somewhat by the developers' interest in reducing parking? or your counter interest to the planning departments that were probably asking them to build more parking than they really needed?
I think at times the school ones were, I think, partly motivated by just concerns about road safety around the school because of the amount of traffic, and they tended to be a partnership between local government and the schools because local government was getting lots of complaints from residents about just all the four-wheel drives driving 3 blocks to pick up the kids from school. The workplace one, my sense there was that where that evolved in Australia was because state departments of transport looked at the experience in the UK and said, if we could do this for larger work sites, we could get some reductions in single occupant vehicle use. And so particularly the state of Western Australia was one of the leaders in working on workplace-based travel plans, and that was very much driven by the state rather than by necessarily the private sector. Yeah. Yeah, State Department of Transportation equivalent, yeah.
And actually, I have a follow-up on that. Does Victoria or Melbourne have any specific GHG reduction targets or mode split targets that the travel plans are intended to tie into?
I'll play us straight back to that and say we've just had a change of Prime Minister, so I'm hoping we will have some greenhouse gas reduction targets. There are certainly no trip reduction targets or anything like that. Yeah.
You flagged ongoing management as one of the biggest gaps or deficiencies. Is management more possible in rental apartment buildings where one entity owns the building and rents every unit?
None of these are one entity, and in fact I would struggle back home. I don't think we have apartment buildings that are like that. So everything, it's either bought by an owner-occupier or it's bought by an investor who then buys it because they want to rent it out. Yeah.
Are there rules and quote-unquote insurance reasons why people can't walk or bring their bicycle into a parking garage, which is very prevalent in, say, New York City or LA? You can't even walk your bike through a garage or a parking structure sometimes.
Yeah, look, you could, and one of the things that I want to do is go back at some of these sites and do a bit of an accessibility assessment of where people are storing their bikes, how they get them in and off the site. Occasionally in apartment buildings you'll see bikes out on balconies that have been brought up in a lift. But I'd be very interested to see what does that do for how regularly people use the bike if it's a pain in the neck to get it out of the apartment. If you've got to juggle it out through the doors and then down in an elevator compared to being able to get it more close by at street level. In fact, when I was speaking to someone at TRB, I can't remember who it was, Miguel, but they said to me that I should go and have a look at an apartment building that's gone up here down at the bottom of the tram, where apparently it's got not only very good bike parking right near it, but there's also a dog wash facility as well. So they've catered for things other than cars, if nothing else.
We have an online question. Someone, after looking at these numbers, said, well, even if the plans are mediocre or really bad, the results are somewhat impressive in terms of achieving. So I don't know if that's an interpretation you want to convey or that.
Look, I suppose given the quality that we assess to the travel plans, it is reassuring that at least that it does appear to be a positive effect. I would like to think that the effect can be have a bit more longer-term stability if we can improve the quality of the travel plan and in particular that how it's implemented. Yeah. Was there a question up the back?
Also, online question as well. So, from your research, do you get any sense of which program within the travel planners schemes or travel planners would be the most effective? And because you focus on the quality of travel plan, trying to come up with assessment for kind of include different programs like the parking, public transit pass, and so on. Do you have any evidence which one may be more effective, which one should be realistic, one focus on?
I'm cautious about saying any one would be more effective, because I really think one of the key things about a travel plan is the extent to which it's tailored to the local site and the local conditions. And that's why part of our assessment framework was around to what extent has the author of the travel plan really thought about the location of the site and its accessibility to transport options. So just saying, oh yeah, providing bike parking is the answer, that's not going to work at an apartment building that's not located near reasonable bike facilities, because having all the bike parking in the world may not be the incentive for someone to ride their bike out on the street. And likewise, saying that, oh, public transport information's the key, well, if the apartment building's located a kilometre away from the nearest train line, that's going to be an issue. So I think, to me, it really is about thinking about the local context and the opportunities in the local area, and tailoring the measures in response to those local conditions. Yeah.
I have a question about this. So these numbers are for A and B.
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe you didn't have access, but maybe at night, when, at certain times of the day, then you could measure, vehicle ownership better and get a sense about...
What we did, these figures are for one point in time. So Chris went into all of the apartments early morning, about 6:15 a.m, and just did a head count of, a count of the cars and a count of the bikes. So it was to try and get at what would have been the overnight park on the site. Yeah.
So much of our policy relating to transportation and mode shift happens at the moment of capital investment, the moment of design approval of building, and then there's so little that is in an ongoing management, regulatory, or even taxing framework. Is there any conversation in Australia about ways that moving towards that management, operations, taxing, regulatory approach to transportation might change?
There is. So I think the first part of your question to me is an absolute key. Once these things have been built, they're there for years. Once that bike parking's been put down a dark alley, down at the bottom of the basement, that's going to be it. It's going to be very difficult to go back and do something to get it in a better position. So I actually believe what we need to do a better job up front is making sure that this infrastructure really delivers real travel choice for residents. Because if we don't do that, once the bloody things are built, we can come back with all the measures in the world, and it's going to be really, really tough.
You're saying that actually they're not even doing a good job at that moment of capital investment.
I agree.
Much less ongoing.
Yeah. Another question up to that?
I just wondered, how is kind of the government there as far as parking pricing? Where do you stand on the Donald Shoup stuff?
But we haven't gone down the road yet of dynamic parking pricing. The CBD has a parking levy that's used to fund public transport. And to put it in a nutshell, Melbourne's giving a lot of thought to what it does on the transport side. Jennifer's left, but when Jennifer visited a couple of years ago, her description of Melbourne was Portland on steroids. Portland on steroids. So Melbourne, it feels so comfortable for me to come and visit Portland, because there's a lot of attributes of Portland that are also in Melbourne. Melbourne's got the world's largest streetcar network. We've got over 250 kilometres of heavy rail. Melbourne is consistently ranked one of the 3 world's most livable cities: Melbourne, Vancouver and Vienna. The real challenge that Melbourne faces, it's a much larger city than Portland. So Melbourne's a bit over 4 million at the moment, and the projections are it's going to go to 5, and it will become Australia's largest city. The challenge, I think, for our transport system is, how does the city grow, but how can we maintain that livability? Because some people back home are saying, when you look at, as cities grow, the scales sort of tip. and the livability starts to go downhill. And yet Melbourne's made much of its livability, and we've got a public transport system that is now absolutely under challenge because we're stretched to the gills in peak period to carry riders. We're seeing a lot of growth in bike riding, particularly to work. But we need, and there is the planning going on for a new underground rail line. We are seeing extensions of the streetcar network. So there is investment going in, but I think a critical issue is going to be, will we make enough investment to ensure that that livability gets maintained in the years ahead? Because the risk is there's a lot of population growth in Melbourne because it's almost one of the hubs of the service economy in Australia, so it's got a fairly strong economy. In Australia, the mining industry has somewhat collapsed, so people are moving back from the mining states back to Melbourne. As that population growth continues, we've really got to make sure we invest in the transport system and the management of it to maintain that livability. And I think that's a challenge. But it presents a lot of great opportunities for people in the transport and the planning professions. So, yeah.
Question, you mentioned that you couldn't think of any buildings that were owned by a single entity and rented completely out.
Well, except for there are some buildings that are owned by the state, and so that's state housing for low-income housing. So
it's not common to have privately owned buildings that are all rented apartments.
Very rare. Off the cuff, most apartment buildings in Australia, I mean, somebody may own multiple apartments, but it's very rare that someone would own all the apartments in a building.
So that's not so uncommon here. Is there economic or...
I've never reflected upon the differences between the two countries. Australia has had quite a long history of investment in real estate, and so that's why a lot of these apartment buildings, the individual apartments are bought by investors. Yeah, I'd need to think about that a bit more. But certainly, it's apart from the State Housing Commission, which is a department of the state that owns apartment blocks for people on low and modest incomes, they're the only ones that I can think of. There are some blocks of apartments where owners they essentially lease their apartment back to an apartment hotel company that then operates the apartments. But that's usually not all the apartments in the tower. It might be a few levels that are managed by a company like that. Most of them tend to be individual owner.
You know, that might turn out to be relevant to between residential TDM here and in Australia, because at least here, my experience has been that the manager of an apartment building is much more intimately involved in the life of the building and the lives of the people than the manager of a condo building. That said, a condo building has an owner-run association. It has its own little mini governance structure. So the tools that work in the two situations might be quite different. The other thing is that if parking spaces are decoupled from apartments or condos, the way that those change hands and the way that those are priced would be different in the two situations.
Yeah, that's true. Where the challenge comes at home is where, as you correctly described it, which is the equivalent of the condo, there is an owners association. But if most of those owners are not residents, they don't give a stuff how people get to and from their apartment. They're just worried about whether the rent's gone into their bank account at the end of the month.
And if they like the landscape.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.